The raider comes around the corner of a palm log bunker at a dead sprint, and there is a Japanese soldier 2 feet in front of him. No time for a rifle, no room for a bayonet. He squeezes the trigger, and the Thompson bucks once, twice, 3 times, and the man goes down. He keeps moving. There is no time to think about what just happened. There is only the next bunker, the next tree line, the next man in the dark who is trying to kill him before he can kill first. This is Makin Atoll, August 1942. It is one of the first American offensive ground operations of the Pacific War, launched 10 days after the landings at Guadalcanal and built on a completely different logic. Where Guadalcanal was a massed amphibious assault, Makin was a surgical strike from submarines, and everything about it, the darkness, the distance measured in feet instead of yards, the speed of it, the absolute savagery of contact at point-blank range, was shaped around one weapon. The Thompson submachine gun was not supposed to be the future. By the time the Marine raiders carried it onto Makin, every serious military theorist in the world had already written its epitaph. The war was supposed to be fought at distance, fire superiority, coordinated movement, rifles. And in one specific branch of the Japanese military, that theory had been elevated to a doctrine so precise, so internally consistent, that it nearly determined the outcome of the Pacific War before America could answer it. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Special Naval Landing Forces, the Rikusentai, were not light infantry in any conventional sense. They were elite assault troops, trained for rapid seizure of coastal and island objectives, and their doctrine centered on a specific tactical calculation: control the perimeter, hold the choke points, and force an attacker to close the distance under fire. The Arisaka Type 38 bolt-action rifle was their primary weapon. Accurate past 400 yards, reliable in sand and humidity, effective in the hands of men who drilled until they could fire and cycle and fire without breaking position. The logic was sound. The theory was that any force attacking a defended island position would exhaust itself in the approach and arrive at the perimeter already degraded. At that point, the defender's rate of accurate fire was more valuable than the attacker's volume. Slow and precise beats fast and scattered. That calculation had centuries of military doctrine behind it. It was not wrong. It was just designed for the wrong enemy. The problem was not the Japanese. The problem was the Pacific itself. When American planners began designing a raiding capability in late 1941 and early 1942, they were confronting a geography that had no equivalent in the European theater. Pacific Island objectives were not open fields or hedgerow country. They were compressed, layered environments. Dense jungle canopy over root systems over undergrowth, with man-made fortifications woven into the vegetation so thoroughly that the defensive line and the jungle floor were the same thing. The effective engagement range in that terrain was not 400 yards. Often, it was not 40. In the approach corridors through mangrove and palm, the first contact with an enemy position could happen at 10 feet, at 5. A rifleman with a bolt-action Arisaka had 1 shot before a man was on top of him. A rifleman with a bolt-action M1903 Springfield had the same problem. The raiders knew this. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson knew this before he ever set foot on a Pacific island. Because he had spent 2 years in China, embedded with the 8th Route Army, watching Mao's guerrillas fight the Japanese in terrain that punished any doctrine built for distance. What Carlson observed in China was a principle that American procurement had not yet absorbed. In close terrain, the weapon that fires most in the shortest interval controls the fight. Not the most accurate weapon, not the longest ranged. The weapon that fills the space between 2 men in the moment of contact, with enough rounds to end the question before the other man can answer it. He came back from China convinced. He wrote his reports, he argued his case, and then he equipped his battalion. The Thompson Model 1928A1 weighed 10.5 pounds, loaded with a 20-round box magazine. It fired the .45 ACP cartridge at approximately 800 rounds per minute on full automatic. The muzzle velocity was just over 900 feet per second, subsonic, which matters for what comes later. But in 1942, what mattered was this. At contact range, inside a bunker, across a trench, in the space between two palm trees in the dark, it did not miss. Not because it was accurate in the technical sense, because it fired fast enough that accuracy became secondary to saturation. The Thompson did not ask a man to aim in the moment of contact. It asked him to point and hold. In the Pacific, that distinction was the difference between a firefight that lasted 3 seconds and one that lasted 30. 30 seconds in a Japanese defensive position was long enough to die in several different ways. 3 seconds was enough to get through it. Carlson issued Thompsons to his men and trained them in close quarters fire until the weapon was an extension of the body, not a tool held at distance. This was not doctrine yet. It was a bet made by one man who had seen the terrain and understood what it demanded. The Thompson itself was not a new weapon. John Taliaferro Thompson had designed it in 1919, conceived as a trench broom for the last weeks of a war that ended before it could be issued. The Army had looked at it, acquired some, filed it away. Gangsters bought it by the crate. The FBI swore by it. The military establishment treated it as a law enforcement curiosity, a weapon for tight corridors and automobile ambushes, not for serious infantry operations. That dismissal was rooted in the same distance-centric logic that shaped every conventional force in the world. A submachine gun was effective to perhaps 50 yards in trained hands, and no serious tactical planner intended to fight at 50 yards if he could avoid it. The Thompson's weight compounded the skepticism. A weapon that heavy and that short-ranged made no sense when a rifle of equal weight could reach 500 yards. The math seemed obvious. What the math missed was the jungle. In a palm grove on a Pacific island, 500 yards of effective range was not an asset. It was dead weight. The relevant number was not maximum effective range. It was the rate of fire inside the range that actually mattered. And there, the Thompson had no competitor in the American inventory. 800 rounds per minute. Theoretical cyclic rate, but even at a controlled 200 rounds per minute in disciplined short bursts, a Thompson-armed raider could put more rounds into a 10-yard radius in 3 seconds than a rifleman could put there in 30. At the moment of contact in dense terrain, 3 seconds and 30 seconds were not comparable intervals. One was survivable. The other was the duration of a man's death. Carlson's gung-ho doctrine, borrowed explicitly from the Chinese communist guerrillas he had embedded with, held that small unit initiative at the point of contact was worth more than coordinated fire from distance. The Thompson was the physical expression of that doctrine. It gave a single raider, or three-man fire team, the ability to decide a close engagement unilaterally, without waiting for the rifle line to suppress, without coordinating a fire superiority that the terrain made impossible anyway. The weapon and the doctrine were inseparable. One without the other was incomplete. Together, they produced something the Pacific demanded and no one else had yet thought to build. The raid on Makin Atoll launched from submarines USS Argonaut and USS Nautilus on the night of August 17, 1942. Around 211 raiders in rubber boats paddling toward a Japanese garrison on Buteriteri Island in complete darkness. Space limitations aboard the submarines had forced each company to leave a rifle section behind, so Carlson's force was already short before it hit the water. The plan called for a pre-dawn landing, a swift strike on the radio station and garrison headquarters, destruction of enemy equipment, and extraction before Japanese air power could respond. Clean, fast, surgical. It did not go that way. The surf swamped half the outboard motors. Raiders landed scattered across a 300-yard beach instead of 2 clean assault waves. By the time Carlson had enough men ashore to push inland, dawn was breaking, and the Japanese garrison, approximately 70 armed personnel of the 62nd Guard Unit, a seaplane-based security force equipped with light weapons, had been alerted. They were not a classic assault formation, but they held prepared positions, they knew every choke point in the terrain, and they had clear fields of fire across the open ground between the beach and the village. What followed was not a raid. It was a running, close-quarters battle through a defended village, across open coral flats, and through coconut groves, conducted in daylight against men who had no intention of moving. The Japanese defenders did exactly what their doctrine prescribed. They held their perimeter positions, channeled the attackers into the approaches, and brought accurate rifle fire onto anyone who moved in the open. It worked. Raiders crossing the open ground between the beach and the village took casualties. 3 men died in the first push. The advance stalled. At that moment, if the raiders had been equipped with rifles, even the M1 Garand, America's finest, they would have been in a sustained firefight against defenders in prepared positions, and the casualty equation would have run in one direction until Carlson broke contact and pulled back. Instead, Carlson sent his Thompson armed men around the flanks and into the trees. Not to suppress, to close. Sergeant Clyde Thompson, who had become the first enlisted Marine to receive the Medal of Honor in the war, moved through the right flank with a group of raiders and took the near end of the Japanese line at a range where the Thompson was not just effective, it was absolute. Inside 20 yards in dense vegetation, the .45 ACP round gave the Thompson serious stopping power at the distances that mattered. A man firing a Thompson through palm fronds at a crouched enemy rifleman did not need to see clearly. He needed to fire. The weapon answered for him. Thompson was killed later that morning in the open, by accurate long-range fire from a Japanese position he could not close on. The weapon had its limits. But inside those limits, on that island, in those trees, the raider companies with the highest concentration of Thompsons penetrated the deepest and held the longest. When the flanks broke in, the Japanese center became a kill zone rather than a strong point. Men who had been pinned in the approaches were suddenly advancing. The moral arithmetic of the fight shifted the moment close-quarters weapons reached contact range, and it did not shift back. By afternoon, Carlson's men had destroyed the radio station, the garrison headquarters, the fuel stores, and the seaplane base. Carlson personally counted 83 Japanese bodies before the withdrawal began, 21 Americans killed or missing, and the extraction was as brutal as the fight. The surf that scattered the landing swamped the outboard motors again on the way out. More than 100 raiders spent an unplanned night stranded on the beach, Carlson at one point drafting a surrender note before scouts confirmed the garrison was finished. 9 men were inadvertently left behind, captured, transferred to Kwajalein, and executed. The raid had worked. The cost of it was real in ways no official account captured cleanly. But the reports that mattered, the ones that went up the chain with recommendations, were about the timbre of the fight, about which men survived contact at close range and which did not, about the specific, documented moments where Thompson-armed raiders had closed on prepared positions that rifle fire had failed to reduce. The Japanese who analyzed Makin, and they did because the raiders left behind boats, equipment, and documents that Japanese intelligence recovered from the island, reached a conclusion that confirms what Carlson already understood. Their defensive doctrine had held in the open. It had failed in the trees. What came back from that island identified the American submachine gun as the primary reason the flank penetrations succeeded. Future island positions should concentrate defenders in the open approaches and accept the jungle margins as a zone of contest. That recommendation was correct, and it was also too late. The raiders had already shown that the jungle margin was not contested ground. It was their ground. The Thompson gave them a weapon that could function in that margin the way Japanese doctrine assumed no weapon could, without clear sighting lanes, without distance, without time to aim. The entire defensive philosophy rested on the assumption that a defender with a rifle behind cover held an inherent advantage over an attacker in the open. It did. The Thompson existed for the moment when the attacker left the open and entered the place where the rifle could not follow. Japanese commanders began reinforcing island garrisons with their own submachine gun assets, the Type 100, and training defenders to contest the jungle approaches directly. But the Type 100 was never produced in sufficient numbers to change the doctrinal balance, and Japanese tactical culture never fully absorbed the close quarters fight as a primary axis. The Special Naval Landing Forces had been built for a particular kind of war. The Raiders had been built for the war that actually existed. There was no correcting that in the middle of a campaign. The Thompsons stayed in Raider hands through Guadalcanal, through New Georgia, through the brutal, grinding island work that lasted until the Raider battalions were formally dissolved in 1944. It stayed not because of institutional loyalty or procurement inertia, but because the men who carried it into the jungle understood something that weight charts and range tables could not measure. Some weapons exist for the distance between training and dying. The Thompson existed for the distance you could not see across, in terrain that had no respect for doctrine, against an enemy whose philosophy was impeccable, and whose tragedy was that they never understood what they were missing until they were already losing. The Marines who carried it knew that the Pacific was not a war of yards. It was a war of feet, and they had a weapon made for that distance. If you believe the story underneath the history, the engineering choice, the doctrinal bet, the specific moment where a decision made before the war proved itself in the dark, then you know where to find more of it.